Application Security Weekly delivers interviews and news from the worlds of AppSec, DevOps, and all the other ways people find and fix software flaws. Join us as we explore how the latest news highlights modern security practices and reminds us of the missing ones. We also bring insights from interviews on topics from training to threat modeling, from open source tools to cloud-native techniques, plus an occasional reference from new wave to synthwave. Find us at securityweekly.com/subscribe or look for Application Security Weekly wherever you pick your podcasts.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. You can follow us on LinkedIn for updates across the organization, show highlights, and more. You can find us by searching for Security Weekly Productions. Of course, if you want links to all my social media, my podcast gear recommendations, links to podcasts I listen to, all my previous, not all, a lot of my previous presentations, you can go to securitypodcaster.com. All righty, Mr. Jeff Mann.
A curated collection of previous talks. How's that,
Jeff,
Paul?
I loved that description way better than the one that I provided. A curated collection of my talks, which is just the ones I could find.
That's why you have me around.
That's why we keep you around. That's just one reason, other than your charming personality and good looks. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Hey, it's great to finally be back. I feel like it's been a while. But
yeah,
it's busy season for PCI. Everybody's got to get done before the holiday season.
That's right. I wanted to
work demands and all that.
I wanted to dive into something that got kind of mislabeled in my stories. And Larry, you and I, this is something that we've been talking about, and it's our good friend Zeno Kova. For those who don't know, Zeno was very prolific researcher in the firmware realm, and I followed his research when I started at Eclipsium. He founded Legbacore, which was then sold to Apple, and worked at Apple for some time. I did a below-the-surface interview with Zeno, which was really, really awesome for a lot of reasons. Zeno also runs Open Security Training 2, which is completely free training that you can go take. You register, all the training's free. I've done some of his course, and it's not just his courses, but others also produce and teach the online courses. Very good quality, amazing stuff. Zeno has apparently been on like a tear, presenting some Bluetooth research. Just to give you kind of a perspective on this, his talk, "It was harder to sniff Bluetooth through my mask during the pandemic," was presented at Hack in the Box, Hacktivity, Hackfest.ca, No Hat, and Sector, all in the last couple of months. That was like August through October. And so he has resources and publications on his website. He also did a talk called Bluetooth Printing, Answer the Questions of WTF Am I Even Looking At? Like, what the fuck am I even looking at? This was like a workshop, I believe, at hardware.io.
Okay.
And that was presented on November 2nd. And recently his GitHub repositories and stuff that has been supporting this research were just updated as early as like yesterday or today. Today. And I've been tracking this, and I've been sending all the links to Larry. I'm like, Larry, you gotta look at this. You gotta look at this stuff. And then you look at this stuff. It is slide deck is like 300 slides.
Yeah, because he exported it with all the builds.
So I think it's roughly 100 slides without the build. It's still really long. And there's some a GitHub repository and a presentation YouTube video of his talk. I haven't consumed all the things. I don't think Larry has either, because it was just happening this week. The basic premise that I get from his research and the question that he wanted to answer was, which Bluetooth chipsets are in various devices? And how would you, as a security researcher, go, if I were to sniff or discover Bluetooth communications on a device, how would I then discern perhaps what chipset is running on it? And one of the things that Zeno did was build this kit with some really interesting hardware that I linked to in the show notes.
Yep.
This is a x86 based. What is it called? What is it called? I want to say it's something up. Hold on. up squared, running an Atom processor, which side channel on that, a little side tangent. This Atom processor is also vulnerable to some research that Positive Technologies did, reverse engineering microcode, and so you can go look at that. But he built this whole kit and has some specific Bluetooth hardware and made it so that you could also put this in an outdoor rated container. And what he did was put it on the side of the highway, on a section of highway that like is prone to traffic jams.
Okay.
And so when cars are going by, there's Bluetooth devices in the car. The cars themselves have Bluetooth. And so he was able to essentially collect a lot of information. What I gathered so far, and we should reach out to Zeno. I think we should probably try and bring him on the show to talk about this because I think it's really interesting. It's almost like a wiggle for Bluetooth, because there was also a GPS component that he built into it.
Yes, and I remember seeing in one of his slide decks that was sort of like in the honorable mentions, appendices, that type of stuff.
Yes,
that there were some comments about Wiggle and Bluetooth.
Yeah, so I don't know what the end. Like Larry and I were talking just before the show. We're like, what's really the end game here? Like, how do we use this data? Is kind of where we're at with what Zeno has built. I think it's up to this point pretty amazing, but I still think we're kind of scratching the surface of like this project. I'm like, that's pretty cool. Can we use this to gain a better understanding about what systems have Bluetooth in them, what they do, and if they are vulnerable? I think it's really cool. Also, just from a nerd perspective, I'm like, I kind of want to build this just because.
Yep. Put it by your own section of the highway.
Right.
Which story of that was yours?
My
Paul?
number one.
Your number one. Oh, disclaimer.
Yeah. Because the disclaimer that he has on this is, he calls this researchware. Like, don't expect this to be easy to set up or use, which Larry and I have been doing Wi-Fi stuff since 2005, and I think that has been the don't expect it to be easy to use and or set up embodies the tools and software and hardware that you would use to do this kind of stuff. So I thought it was pretty awesome. Larry, what did you take away from? And I know, much like myself, you haven't had a lot of time to unpack because there's a lot of content. To unpack.
So some of the stuff that you were sending me earlier on from his work, the first one was like the entire timeline of Bluetooth and Bluetooth low energy vulnerabilities.
Oh my God, he totally nails it. That's the other part. Sorry, Larry. When you go to his website, you can click on the Bluetooth security timeline.
Yep.
And it's an entire chronicling of where does it go back to? Where does it start?
Oh gosh, early.
2001.
Yep.
Until today, of all of the research. And he did this for firmware as well. So he creates these, I forget what tool he uses, TikiWiki, something like that. The TikiWiki that he chronicles all of the research in this area. I'm like, this is amazing. We need to do this for more things. I mean, it's a lot of work, but
and arguably, I think he may have missed stuff, which is to be expected. Because it's a wiki. I'm assuming you're intended to contribute and so forth. But I mean, I think he hit the really big players, and that was kind of the point with some of the big attacks and so forth. So that one really struck me as being pretty damn cool of having that Bluetooth attack timeline. But I also think on some of the newer attacks like Bias and Knob, he did a really good job of explaining what those attacks really end up doing just by looking at the slides, not seeing any of the presentations, any of that type of stuff. To drill down to really what makes those attacks possible. So I thought that was really, really good job as well.
Zeno does an amazing job of taking extremely technical content and distilling that down in analogies. Like I'm jealous as to how well he does that. I'm like, dude, you nail it all the time. Because I've taken some of his trainings. He does the same thing, dude.
Yes.
So definitely check it out. It's my story number one. There is a ton of content if you're interested in Bluetooth specifically research, this is the definitive source in a sense of learning about a lot of this stuff, at least familiarizing yourself with it. And I know, Larry, you cover a lot of Bluetooth hacking in your classes at SANS as well, where you get the hands-on experience as well.
Hell yeah.
It's great stuff. Anyway, that was my storm number one, so that's where I started. You want to talk about mainframe? Where do you want to go next? You want to talk about mainframe security?
Sure.
Anyone?
Jeff might like this story.
Mainframe security?
Yeah, I remember mainframes. Let's do it.
So you may remember mainframes, but you should also remember mainframes today. So I'm going to read you some stuff, quotes from this article. And I'm going to start with...
Let's be honest, Jeff remembers stone tablets and chiseling binary into them.
Could be.
And I didn't use a slide rule. I used an abacus.
Right.
So go ahead.
Mainframe systems handle an estimated 90% of credit card transactions. Is that
true?
I mean, there's a link there.
True statement.
Yeah.
Is that because on the Larry and I were
conservative estimate?
Is that because on the Larry and I were talking about this, making sure we get the terminology right on the payment processor side? Their
Correct.
back end, like a MasterCard, American Express, their back end is a mainframe.
Correct. I can neither confirm nor deny, but yeah. I mean, a lot of financial services companies, which is where the payment processors and the car brands fall, still using mainframe. Absolutely.
And then it says, according to a Deloitte study, 71% of Fortune 500 companies continue to rely on mainframes, and 90% of executives expect to expand their mainframe footprint. In a day and age where we're talking about we should push into the cloud native apps, blah, 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 we're hit with we're expanding our mainframe footprint.
Yeah,
Did I mention to you guys that I mean, when was the last time I talked to you guys? I was at a conference back in September and met a young lady. I think she's 25, and she had just gone through some sort of training course. She works for a financial services company, but she introduced herself as a COBOL programmer.
Wow.
That is still
a thing.
Uh-huh.
And apparently at least one financial services company is training a younger set of people to actually know how to use COBOL and program it. So, yeah, and COBOL runs on mainframes, by the way. That's why I brought it up.
So I actually took 2 semesters of COBOL in college.
Which explains a lot about you, Larry.
30 years ago? 25 years ago? When was that,
1994, 1995 time frame.
Yeah,
which is
so 30-ish years ago.
Is it 30?
Oh, God,
Jesus
don't
Christ.
say it like that. It makes us feel old, Jeff. Come on now.
But, Jeff, to make it even worse...
Welcome to my world.
But to make it even worse, we took a COBOL class, and the instructor taught us on a whiteboard. And we wrote all of our programs on paper.
Oh, God.
I believe that.
Yep.
Wait, you didn't actually put your programs on the mainframe?
Nope. Because the only mainframe that was in the university was used for
running the
university. So they wouldn't.
Working at a university, we had a mainframe that ran essentially the critical systems for the university.
Yep.
Largely were running the mainframe.
Larry, I'm going to find you an AS400 for your birthday if I can.
Technically not a mainframe, though.
Yep.
It's the only one I know of that fits in a briefcase, okay? So, fuck you.
It's
arguably the university had a mainframe, and it was an AS400, but it would not fit in a briefcase.
No, they make AS400s that fit in a briefcase. They're the demo models for the salespeople.
Yeah.
And
we had one that looked like I had one that looked like a PC.
Yep.
It was a power PCE based chip, and it ran OS 400, and it was, like you said, Josh, used for like testing purposes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It wasn't the mini refrigerator is kind of how I think of AS400s, but I always
or if you had a row of those mini refrigerators that like our university did.
Yeah. But I always thought of the AS400 as like a more of a mini
Technically, it's a mini computer.
Mini computer, which is weird because
it wasn't very mini for the most part.
It wasn't very mini. It was
you got to go back in time. You got to remember that computers took up a room. A mini computer took up a side of a room.
Right, Jeff?
A microcomputer took up a desk.
Right, Jeff?
Yeah, roughly. I'll go with those dimensions.
This is bastardizing, but Jeff, you know what I'm talking about.
The mainframe was always in the basement in a very large room.
I mean, if Jeff is going to give me shit about going to college 30 years ago, I'm going to give him shit about that.
So I think of mainframes as in my mind IBM Z family,
sure,
which runs ZOS and Linux,
Cray.
Cray was what would you call that, a mainframe?
Yes. No, that was absolutely a mainframe.
Okay.
DEC something or other.
Back in the day, sure.
VAX VMS.
When a computer has a seating bench integrated into it, it's probably a mainframe.
It's
right.
Mainframe.
So they say well, in this article, they say the market continues to grow. So they say IBM Z systems, Fujitsu's GS series, and Unisys Libra servers are the most popular mainframe ecosystems today in our modern world. I agree. Back in the day, it was the names that you mentioned. They say Z Systems alone saw a 21% year-over-year revenue growth in 2022. Again, like we think of organizations pushing to the cloud and blah, blah, blah. But here we are with mainframes. And how often do we talk about mainframe security? This article that I cover is, from...
We don't talk about it all the time.
Much at all.
Well, not on air.
No, not on the air. I talk about it as part of my job all the time. I talk to financial institutions all the time that still have mainframes. And so I talk about it in terms of data classification, certificate automation.
Telnet? Do they still use Telnet to get into the mainframe?
Only if you're in, and the other thing I talked to them about is segmentation. So only if you're on that network segment, then yes, you can potentially use Telnet, but normally that's turned off. I recommend that be turned off. But I mean, I had to learn how to do, how to work with RACF.
They pay you big bucks for that recommendation too, don't they, Jeff?
They do.
I get paid reasonably well, but I make the medium bucks. But it's along the lines of, this is a very common thing right now. For me, one of the common questions I ask, especially when we start talking certificate automation, is, do you have a mainframe? They go, why? I'm like, because some of the vendors for certificate automation don't handle mainframes very well. So that's a factor that you have to take into account. Venafi is the only one that really does decently with mainframe certificates. So AppViewX and Keyfactor don't.
I don't. Other than this article, who authored by Robert Lemos, talking about how mainframes are still used, doesn't really point out any gross security controls that are missing. In fact, just the opposite. It says the system has a plethora of security controls, and this is kind of what I remember of mainframes. So the user authentication, access controls, decentralized security administration, discretionary and mandatory access controls, logging to the system's management facility, resource controls, auditability and accountability. To me, that's an argument that mainframes have at least have all of the facilities possible to maintain a really solid security architecture for them. Yet, go ahead, Jeff.
It's possible. There's other considerations, I think, that come into play. I've had clients over the years where we've looked at mainframes. I think I've told the story on air before, where I, back in my pen testing days when I was still doing that, I rooted a mainframe. I got admin access to a mainframe. Part of what makes mainframes potentially secure is most of the bad guy community has never seen them, doesn't know how to touch them, doesn't know how to approach them. And many of the attacks that are prevalent these days, because they're lucrative, never get close to a mainframe. But I would agree with the statement that mainframes, the ones that I've worked with, do have the potential and do have security architectures. They're also somewhat similar to your AS400 days, Paul. They're also very limited in features and functionality and commands, and there just isn't a lot there to work with. I mean, the most exploitation that I was familiar with when it came to mainframes, and I'm dating, I'm going back 20-ish years now, was that when the mainframe started running a TCP/IP stack and started emulating the stuff we were familiar with, then we could get to at least the partitions on the mainframe that we knew how to dealt with. But I wanted to also mention, you act shocked that mainframes are still out there, but think of all the credit card transactions in the world at any given moment, and they're all going to 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different credit card companies, trying to get that instantaneous approval so that you can take your stuff and leave the store or get your Amazon order processed. Mainframes are they're workhorses, and they're powerful, and they can process a lot of stuff, and it's very simple things in terms of complexity, but they can do it really fast and do a lot of them. I mean, that's why mainframes are still the backbone of everything. I think it's a fair statement to say everything in financial services related.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I've said this on the show in the past, that the mainframes and AS400 are very transactionally efficient, if that's a term, right? Like if you're, like you said, Jeff, processing a lot of transactions that need to access and or live in a database.
We're talking trillions of transactions.
Yeah, like huge scale,
if not
right?
more than that.
Yeah. Those platforms lend themselves very nicely to solve that problem. And it was Philip Young, soldier of Fortran. It is like in my assessment, the one person in our community who regularly posts and disseminates information and presents about mainframe security.
Big Endian Smalls also.
Okay.
So, yeah, Soldier of Fortran and Big Endian Smalls.
And we've interviewed, I think, both of them. Certainly, Soldier of Fortran has come on the show way back in the day. And I'm looking, he presented 3 years ago at Wild West Hackin' Fest about hacking mainframes. Mm-hmm. So there's still, but like, that video has like 300 views. It's also not like it's not a hot topic in information security, whereas I think Philip would agree with me. I think it should be, right? Consider if 90% of credit card transactions are going through a mainframe, it should be more of a topic in our industry, in my opinion. I guess that's what this article reminded me of.
Yep, you're not wrong.
I'm curious. The article referenced a Deloitte study, but I don't see a link to the Deloitte study that started some of those statistics you were citing at the very beginning based on a Deloitte study. I suppose I could Google it and maybe find it, but I'm curious to see how they came up with some of those percentages.
Right.
Because I agreed with your first one that you asked me about, but the other ones I'm like, it might be a skewed view that they were taking.
I don't think they're that far off, though. Even if they're skewed, Jeff, right? Like I still, I don't see them. If we were to analyze the data and correct it, I don't see it going in the opposite direction, right? Like I don't see it going in the decline of mainframe adoption. I still think that we'd probably see an increased adoption based on everything we talked about so far.
I won't disagree. I'm more curious to find the Deloitte study if it's out there somewhere. I'm interested in reading that.
What do we want to go to next? We want to talk about.
I got one.
Larry's got one.
My number 3, Apple Find My Network going to be abused to steal keylog passwords.
Oh, I saw this.
Yeah, and as I was reading this, I'm like, this is a load of crap. And then I realized, no, this is really cool. This is not a load of crap, and it takes a little work to make it happen. So it's not like let's be clear here. Apple's Find My Network is the effective collection of Apple devices that are observing AirTag devices and the AirTag Bluetooth Low Energy protocol to observe devices in the field and can report where they are, because we get this one that's really sad. We've got an AirTag on the dog, on a collar, like Paul, like you do.
Yep.
And if we leave the dog in the car while we go into the grocery store, when it's cool out and the windows are cracked and he's got his favorite spooky tunes on, he's fine. When you start walking away from the car, it says Finn has been left behind. And I tell this to the kids every time. It's, oh, so sad. We left the dog behind. But that can be tracked because it's not only tied to our iPhones. Every iPhone and every iDevice on the planet can receive these AirTags and can report the location of those devices back to Apple Central Find My service. Mm-hmm. So when I saw my Find My Network can be abused to steal keylog passwords, I'm like, is there a vulnerability in the Apple AirTags that allows us to get a keylogger installed? And no, there is not. The point being here is if you have a keylogger or some other method for obtaining data, the Apple AirTag Bluetooth Low Energy protocol can be used to populate arbitrary data. And once you have arbitrary data into the air over Bluetooth Low Energy in the AirTag language, it is received by every other Apple device and then pushed to the centralized Find My Network. Mm-hmm. So you could
What the fuck? Are you serious?
Seriously. So you could effectively use this as
an exfiltration device.
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to necessarily be keylogged passwords or whatever they're claiming for, or HISA security is claiming this. It can be any arbitrary data that you can transmit over Bluetooth.
How do you convince the phone to send its keystrokes to the Find My Network?
Well, so that's the magic that you have to figure out. Mm-hmm. The example in the HISA security article was they took an implant and they put an implant in a keyboard, and it received all of the keystrokes that were being sent to the computer, and then took those to a device like an ESP32, and used that ESP32 to take that data and send it out over AirTag to be received by other iPhone devices to be transmitted to the Find My Network.
Oh, I see.
Right. So it's a transport exfil
They're
method.
using the Find My Network as a transport mechanism, not hacking an iPhone to send its key logs.
Correct.
Oh, okay.
Correct.
I gotcha.
Yep. Yeah.
I read the original research quickly.
I did the same thing.
Which you can't do. If you're going to read the original research, you got to sit down and read it and understand it.
Yep.
And I get it now. It's the Find My Network that is the vehicle.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And we've talked about it on the show. We did a little technical segment about the Apple AirTags.
Sure.
In the Sec 617 for Sans, we talked about
Sec 17. Yep.
Yep, definitely.
That's not legal.
Only if you do it with six of them. The SEMO Labs folks that pioneered being able to build your own third-party AirTags using other chipsets and emulating the protocol. It gives you the opportunity to create arbitrary data over that protocol, have it populated the Find My Network, and if it's something that's registered to, quote, you receive all of that data. Fun stuff.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Do we want to go? What do we want to do? Do we want to do fun, or do we want to do more serious kind of stuff?
Let's do serious.
Let's do serious and make it fun.
Okay, do serious and make it fun.
If you're the only one that can take serious and make it as fun as you do, sir.
Well, I mean, this one could be fun because it says Looney.
He does PCI, so like, what do you expect?
Looney Tunables is being exploited by Kinsing. So
the band?
No, the threat actor group, Kinsing Threat Actors.
Sorry.
Are you?
Like, I heard NSYNC, and I'm like, wait, the band?
What? The Looney Tunables exploit is the Kinsing, right? This is the Looney Tunables was what now? CVE 2023-4911 was discovered by Qualys. Oh, this is the glibc. Yes, I found this in my travels this week. I was like, wow, that's a vulnerable glibc. And I'm like, why is glibc vulnerable? I'm like, oh, there was a big exploit. It had a name. It's called Looney Tunables. And threat actors basically latched onto this and are exploiting this in like cloud environments and stuff like that. And this is a local privilege escalation exploit. And they're like, oh, well, if I can gain a foothold in cloud servers, I can escalate to root and game over. I can put my stuff on there and I can do that stuff. Yes.
Not to nitpick, but what does being local in the cloud mean?
I think it was a PHP. One of the things I'm seeing on here is it initial PHP exploit. So it was a web interface or application that they're using to gain a foothold. And then from there, they're like, oh, I'm not root yet, but I can be root because it has a vulnerable glibc because it hasn't been updated. And I can gain root.
I do not think you used the word local correctly then, but whatever.
Well, it is. Well, so it's a remote exploit that gets me on the system. Then it's a local exploit that lets me escalate privileges.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So yeah, I told you it was serious.
This is serious.
This is serious business.
So serious, we called it Looney Tunes.
So serious, we called it Looney. Well, Qualys called it Looney Tunes, but the Qualys team does great work. I mean, they find like really cool exploits in open source software. So yeah.
So yeah, we talked about Looney Tunables, and like, yeah, and now it's a reality.
Which kind of begs my theory that most. I'm going on a limb here a little bit. Most threat actors are looking at security research and or vulnerabilities that have already been disclosed. Very few threat actors are discovering new stuff, doing their own security research, and using it for their own purposes. And again, I also I don't have a lot of data to back that up, but just based on my observations and talking with people, that's my general sense.
Yeah, I think
like we as the air quotes good guys or good people, right, are doing all the really hard security research and all this cool stuff and 0 days and how to exploit this stuff, and bad threat actors are using that to commit crime.
Yep.
Which is a terrible way to put it. When I put it that way, I'm like, is this broken? Should we not be doing it this way?
And I think using threat actors in this particular case may not be the right word, because if there's certainly all levels of skill for threat actors, because you could be talking, Jimmy in mom and dad's basement, who's 14 years old as a script kiddie, who is a threat actor, and then there's a nation state which is also a threat actor. And I think one of those using something that somebody's already developed in an evil capacity versus something that they've developed to use for an evil capacity are two different things. And it becomes down to education and resources. So.
Well, but I think you're missing at least one category, Larry. There's the 14-year-old quote-unquote script kiddie that's also basically in a sweatshop that's working for organized crime or
North Korea
or some nation state, but they're doing it not so much for they're doing it for fun and profit, let's say, not necessarily to disrupt things.
I'd say they're doing it more for profit. how I would categorize most threat actors today. I think long gone are the days of the hacker that was like, oh, I can break into these systems, so I will break into these systems.
And I'll go explore.
And I'll go explore and do shenanigans. Now, even if it's the teenage hacker, they're in a country, well, or from a background that has not afforded them the luxury of going to school in any capacity or what have you. And so they're like, I'm going to learn computer stuff, and I'm going to get paid to do computer hacking stuff. And whether it's illegal or not doesn't matter because I'm getting paid to do computer stuff.
Yep.
That's Allison.
But that kind of
go ahead.
That kind of reinforces, what your original supposition that maybe we're doing something wrong, because in the early days when it was mostly the casual, what can I do? Even from the movie Hackers, the teenagers in there weren't doing anything really bad. They were just being mischievous and demonstrating their capabilities, let's say. But things kind of changed when the bad guys figured out how to monetize more efficiently,
right?
And basically figured out a way to make money by doing all this stuff, and it became a business. And I agree with your concern. I've had similar thoughts that, especially some of the vulnerabilities that we've discussed over the years that were a lot of research and a lot of work went into them. And, people finally find some, what I would call obscure or convoluted is not really the right word, complex ways to figure out a way to exploit something or to find a vulnerability. And I've always had the thought that a lot of the bad guys out there aren't taking the time to do that kind of research, maybe nation state level, but most of this category of people that are in it for profit, they're absolutely looking for the research of others to try to figure out how to apply it and exploit it. So maybe we should reconsider disclosure, frankly.
Also, on the flip side of that, if I don't know that something is vulnerable or has a weakness, I'm in a significant disadvantage to defend said system.
Yeah, but I think most of the bad guys out there, they're not, I started saying this 10 years ago around the time of the Target breach, but most bad guys out there other than nation states are not targeting a specific organization. They're just out there trolling, trying to find anybody that's got the exploitable vulnerability du jour that they're looking at. And once they find someone that's vulnerable, then they can, then they try to figure out how to monetize it. Do they have something worth stealing? Enter ransomware, where it really doesn't matter, and it's sort of indiscriminate, because they can hit anybody, and hopefully they probably have statistics on the types of organizations that they discover their vulnerability and how much money they should be able to extort from.
But all the more reason to patch, my friend, right? Based on your description.
I don't disagree with that.
Okay.
I don't disagree with that at all. But we talk about prioritization, and do we really have to do all those mediums and lows, but the system might break, or the application might break. I've been hearing that for 30 years.
Yeah, that weighing.
I still hear it to this day.
I know, but I don't think we're ever going to get around, Jeff, the operational risk versus security risk argument, because it's a hard one to combat. You need to patch this thing because something bad could happen. But also on the operational risk side, they're like, well, if we patch it, also something bad could happen. So the best scenario is to not do anything, because then nothing bad could happen unless someone comes and compromises it, right? But nothing bad's going to happen unless someone comes along and compromises it.
Right.
Or maybe the emphasis should be, while patching is important and you should patch as early and as often as possible, my personal opinion, too much emphasis over the years on vulnerabilities and the belief that, if we can just eliminate all the vulnerabilities, then we won't get breached, we won't get attacked, we won't suffer a compromise. But maybe more emphasis should be placed on detecting, not necessarily detecting and prevention, like an IPS type of system, but detecting the weird, bad stuff that's happening, and maybe you don't prevent,
right,
in all cases, the malware, but maybe you have all the other things in place to minimize the damage, but detect it more quickly, and minimize the damage. I mean, if we get over the notion that security means I'm never going to get breached, and start thinking about security being, I'm going to eliminate some of the low-hanging fruit, but I won't eliminate all of it. But I'm going to have processes and things in place that's going to help me detect when the bad things happen, when the things go south, so we can detect it early. I mean, I wasn't around for the show to talk about MGM. Maybe I was on one show, but what happened at MGM kind of blows up all of these discussions, because what ultimately, and what have I been saying for a long time, all the weaknesses always end up being a process failure.
Yep.
So
yeah, Jeff, why
not focus more on process?
What I think I heard you say there was something that I think Paul and I have said from back to almost near episode 1 of the show, was you need to be in a state of, it's not a matter of if you get breached, it's a matter of when.
Yep.
But I don't think today we can bank on. And Josh, are you all right? I don't know what's going on. He's nodding his head yet. But I don't think we can bank on we're going to be able to respond fast enough. I think if that's your strategy, it's a losing strategy, because the way that, let's take ransomware operators work, it's a very short time window from bad, initial access to bad things happening. And we need to unpack that a little more, because initial access could happen, and it's such a low and slow and low profile initial access that maybe months later is when something bad happens, and that happens really quickly, right? And your chances of detecting that kind of low and slow, couple of months dwell time are pretty weak, because they're not really doing anything, right? They're just I got a foothold, cool, and your ability to detect that foothold, you're looking for a needle in a stack of needles. Mm-hmm. And then when that time comes that holy crap, bad things are going to happen, you have very little time to respond. So you're better off getting rid of that attack surface as much as you can over time. And one of the statistics that I think is really backing up our notion of you need to patch things is that threat actors are, from the data that I've seen recently, more and more going to and relying on exploitable vulnerabilities versus phishing. Right. And I don't have the links and all that stuff, but that's something I'm hearing. And you challenge me on that, certainly. I'm welcome to have the conversation, because if that's the case, that means we need to be more aggressive at patching and getting rid of these notions that, something bad's not really going to happen, so I got time to patch. When really, I don't think you do.
Well, it goes back to the basic risk equation, because we're talking about risk at some level here, and there are only 3 components or variables that go into risk, and I'm oversimplifying for the sake of discussion, but it's vulnerabilities, threats, and it's countermeasures. So patching relates to reducing the number of vulnerabilities. Threats are the bad actors and the things that they do to launch against you, and then there's the countermeasures. And
where's the impact? Where's the impact in that equation? Because I'm a big fan of impact. If there was a T-shirt,
impact,
a
by
security
impact, do you mean consequence?
Yes, exactly.
Or likelihood?
Not likelihood. I mean, put all the other things aside. If someone gets in, what can they do? What is the impact to my organization that's a result or a consequence of this particular breach.
So to answer your question, that is defined when you're defining the risk. What is it that we're worried about happening?
Right.
How bad is it?
How bad is it? Yes.
And what are the components that make us more or less likely to have this really bad event happen, which are the existence of vulnerabilities in your environment, the threats, the people that would actually want to go after you. And that's, it used to be, in the early days when I was learning this, it was a clearly defined bad guy who had something out for, you had something that they wanted, or they had something against you, like a hacktivist type of thing, or it's nation state or whatever. But again, I mean, what blows this up a little bit is the fact that so many of the threat actors aren't going after you. So the threat is almost incidental if you happen to have those vulnerabilities. But what can you do to prevent the threats from being able to get to the system that has the vulnerability? What do you do to make it harder? And that's where we have concepts in security of access controls and permissions and privilege and layers and security in depth and filters and firewalls and things like that. Make them have to work for it at least. And even those, I would argue, sort of blur into countermeasures, but I think at the end of the day, countermeasures are also the detection mechanisms, the things that you do. And in the early days, it was easier, but the most secure organizations I ever met had administrators that knew their networks, knew their systems, knew their applications, and they knew it so well, they could just get that gut feeling something's not right here. And
I mean, or we could just throw caution to the wind and sit on the podcast and eat Halloween candy like Josh.
Awesome.
It's paying the dad tax right there.
Is that a Reese's? Is that what you're digging into right now?
A Reese's Take 5.
Oh, nice. Good
God
choice.
Damn it, Josh.
Well, that certainly blew the moment, but
it did. But what I hear you saying, Jeff, and collectively we've all thought about this topic for a really long time, right? But I gleaned something I think somewhat new in my brain from this, is that we work in all these areas of the risk equation to reduce the bad things. We try to reduce our attack surface. We try to reduce the vulnerabilities. We try to reduce the impact, right, in everything that we do in security, which is interesting. We're like the office of reduction if we're doing it right, that we're trying to reduce risk as an overall term. But if you look at all the equations and factors that go into risk, we're in a reduction thing of reducing attack surface, reducing the number of vulnerabilities, reducing the likelihood and probability of mixing those terms, but messing up the attackers, right? And reducing the impact, which is the big one for me, because impact to me weighs most heavily. If the consequences of this breach are my business shuts down, that's the most universal way to convey an aspect of risk to a board or the owner or founder of the organization, that this is going to disrupt your business, and your business could shut down from that. That is the greatest impact, right? And when I think about impact at a slightly more technical level, I'm like, attackers could remove all the data from all of your systems, right? They could lock you out of all your systems, delete all the data, permanently damage your system. That's a really high impact that I think almost doesn't carry enough weight as I think it should, is that impact.
Well, and I think part of the reason why it doesn't, I wouldn't say it's carry the weight, why people don't focus on that more is, so let's go with your thought a little bit. Your impact is the biggest thing. You have to put a dollar value on it at some point. What is the cost of your business? I mean, going out forever, that's kind of moot, I guess. But what's the cost of again, look at MGM. How many days were they offline in so many different ways? And, how many millions, if not billions of dollars did they lose in lost revenue?
Huge impact. Huge impact.
Did they calculate all that ahead of time?
Yeah.
Maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, if anybody did, casinos probably do have that. I mean, but again, going back to financial services companies, I've worked with financial services companies that calculate how much they lose almost by the nanosecond of downtime of operations.
Yep.
They know that impact. But so then you have to you come up with a dollar amount, and then you have to decide, okay, how much is it? How much are we going to spend and invest in preventing or reducing the likelihood that this bad impact happens?
Right.
And that's where things go off the rails for most companies, because very few companies can afford it.
It's hard to come.
Articulate it.
I find it hard to come up with an analogy. I think many of us will go to personal hygiene and health, but it's a hard analogy to talk about that in relation to what you were just describing, Jeff, in impact and cost, right? Like, I think in your personal health, I think Larry and I were having this discussion somewhat about like the food we eat. Like, oh my God, I get heartburn. And I can minimize the impact by choosing what I
don't drink.
Only have 2 liquor bottles in front of you instead of 4.
Yeah, no, don't drink alcohol. Don't drink tomato. Don't have anything with tomatoes in it. Don't eat spicy foods. Don't have coffee.
Don't smoke cigars. Don't drink alcohol, and don't have anything spicy. I'm like, but
life's not worth living at that point.
Like, I want to wake up every day and I want to have a cigar and a Bloody Mary, and you're like messing with my life. Like, what is going on now?
And that's 3 out of the 6 that you shouldn't have.
Right.
And that's not even that's before noon. Oh, cigar and a Bloody Mary. So tomatoes, alcohol, something spicy. No, 4 and a cigar.
Right.
Like, oh God, dude.
So good analogy.
I so much feel.
Sorry, go ahead,
I so much feel that right now. Like, I'm watching Josh eating Halloween candy.
I think that's what killed me too. Is last night. Holy crap! Last night I was watching TV downstairs, and my kids. So I have 3 kids, and they all went trick or treating. And I dumped collectively all their candy into a giant box. And like, legit, this box might weigh 10 pounds. And so like I'm sitting there watching TV, and I'm like, I kind of want a snack. I'm like, do I feel like going upstairs? I'm like, wait, there's 10 pounds of candy.
Yep.
Like, literally,
you were
10 feet from where I am. I'm like,
you were high.
Yeah, I could probably go dig through that and find a couple of, just like a couple pieces. But then
let's just bring the box right over here.
Yeah, dude, you're digging through 10 pounds of candy. I don't know how that relates to a conversation.
So this is a good analogy to work with, Paul. And what I was going to bring out is that it's very imprecise and it's very subjective. But the impact that you may or may not have been considering ultimately would be death.
Right.
But more than likely some physical discomfort for some amount of time.
I was like, I'm not going to die if I eat this candy, but I'm probably not going to be in great shape tomorrow. And turns out I had some pretty serious heartburn when I woke up. Like, wonder why that is.
But the analogy that I used to
like
how much?
Like 4 out of the 10 pounds.
Like 4 but they're small. They're fun size, Josh. So they're small.
And they're supposed to be fun, goddammit.
They're fun. So I ate 4 Snickers, but they were fun size. So
4 Snickers gave you heartburn?
No, I ate more than that.
I was going to say, no, try again.
Josh, the 4 was just the Snickers. Like,
that's right. Yes. That was
we won't talk about the Twizzlers and the Starburst.
I go around the world. I'm like, I want some Snickers and some Twix and some 3 Musketeers and
Kit Kats.
Some Kit Kats.
Charleston Chew.
And a Reese's. And I'm like, throwing a payday for good measure.
A Charleston Chew.
You forgot the sour stuff.
No, I don't go to that.
Fish.
No, I didn't go to that.
Let's bring it back.
Focus.
Paul.
Sorry.
Focus.
Jeff, bring us back.
The point I'm trying to make is that this is a very subjective argument that most companies think about to some degree, but don't really like to really take it to its logical conclusion, which is determine how much you're willing to spend or not spend on all, because everything we're talking about costs money,
right?
And it all goes against the bottom line, and it all has to be weighed against the likelihood that this really bad impact happens. And most companies, and I'm generalizing, will fall down on, it hasn't happened yet. Let's roll the dice. Let's take our chances. Let's get a cyber insurance policy and hope for the best. I mean, in the early days when I was going out talking to clients, when I first came out into the private sectors, even PCI, the companies that I went to weren't asking about, what's the best security practice? What should we be doing here? They would always ask, what is everybody else working
doing
with that's in our industry doing? Because we don't want to do any more or less, because when the bad happens, we won't be held irresponsible.
Right. But when the bad happens, you wish you had that. And I was thinking of that analogy, or that line of thinking, Jeff, where like I have a lot of security cameras in my house, and I did that not because I'm like, well, what do my neighbors have? I did that because experience. Like, there's been times where I'm like, phew, like, good thing we had that. Like, good thing we had that level of visibility to identify a threat. And that was important in that particular scenario. Like, good thing I had those cameras to see if there was a threat and what that threat looked like. Yep. I wasn't thinking about, hey, I want to get cameras. Let me go ask my neighbors, like, hey, what do you like you have for cameras? Like, what's the minimum amount I can spend on cameras?
Right.
I don't know. It's like a weird sociology thing when we think of it.
It's subjective.
Yeah.
And
it is, right. Subjective is the right word.
You have what you think is right for you,
right,
which may or may not be enough, depending on, there's some scenario where somebody, if they really want to go after you, is going to get to you, right?
Yep.
But we don't like to think about that. I mean,
right.
How many years has it been? 22, a little bit over 22 years ago. A lot of people weren't thinking about a terrorist hijacking a plane and flying it into a building. I mean, that wasn't on the top of everybody's tabletop exercise.
Not even the federal law enforcement folks that do that type of stuff.
Right.
So the illustration I used to give to clients in the early days, and I'm dating myself. A popular car 25 years ago, BMW, Mercedes Benz, whatever the $100,000 car was back in the day. There used to be a product, I don't know if it's still available, called the Club. You remember the Club?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. We can talk about this. Yes.
The bar, that locks the steering column, so if somebody gets into the car and even starts the engine, they can't do much because there's this club there, so they can't steer the damn thing.
Right.
Let's say the club cost $100. I don't know how much it costs. Let's say you're the owner of a $100,000 car that is, very popular for the professional car thieves to steal, strip it down, sell it for parts and all that kind of stuff. So the organized crime aspect of car theft, you've got a car that's desirable. Is $100 enough to
$44.19 on Amazon?
All right, plus tax. Let's say $50.
Okay, $50. I like $50. Yep.
Enough money to invest to protect against the likelihood of somebody stealing your car. And by the way, there's professional car thieves. They know how to defeat the club.
Oh yeah. So what they do, Jeff, what I saw in the 90s when the club was popular was people walking out to their parking spot where their car was, and in place of their car was their steering wheel with their club still attached to the steering wheel in the in the parking space.
All right. So now the flip side of that is, let's say you're a young adult, you're in college, you're working your way through college, you've got a part-time job delivering pizzas, and that's how you're paying your way through school.
Sure.
And you bought a $1,000 clunker, but it's the car that you have, and it's your way of not only providing income and putting food on the table, but it's also the way that you're paying for your college.
Are you going to invest the $50? Yeah. Are you going to invest the $50 in the club?
$50 worth the investment in the club?
But I like this analogy because
it's a very different It's the same question.
Because your security investment,
circumstances.
your security investment is, there's multiple factors that go into that. You may not have invested a lot of money in your car because it only cost $1,000, and in the terms of cars, that is not expensive for a car, right? But you own a Honda, and since there are so many Hondas on the road, that means the demand for parts is much higher. So while your car may only be worth $1,000, and you're like, who would want to steal my car? Turns out a lot of people want to steal your car because the parts for your car are really
worth
have a
about
lot of
$4.
have a lot of resale value because there's a shortage. It's supply and demand. There's a shortage on. So in the 90s, that was the case. Honda was like the most sought after vehicle for car thieves because it had the most demand for parts. It wasn't the most expensive car. It could be parked next to a Lamborghini or whatever, but they'd steal your Honda because I could get a lot of money for the parts.
And it was
on
like
this.
10 years of Hondas were interchangeable. It's like 1995 to 2004.
Is that true? Yeah.
Like
so that played a factor as well, Josh. That's a good point.
You could get a Honda and rip it down, and there's a gazillion people that want the parts.
Now, and Sir Mix-a-Lot was going to roll up in his Honda, right?
Right.
Let me.
My Anaconda don't want none unless you got buns.
Paul,
sorry.
You can do by side bends or sit-ups.
Let's sprinkle in a few more considerations, which, I'm trying to extend the analogy, but let's put it in the context of what we're talking about, cybersecurity, and what do you do to invest to secure your organization. Let's talk about the idea of best practices. So you have the club or you don't. Where are you parking your car? Are you parking it under a street light? Is it on the street? Is it in a garage that's also locked? What kind of lock is on the garage? Is there a lock on the garage? Is it visible from the seat? These are all considerations that go into, and think about the ways we blame the victims. And I'm talking about this because I missed the first segment because I was on a virtual happy hour talking to the CEO of SolarWinds. And so it was
this ties into supply. I can tie the supply chain into this very well.
So that's one element, but also was the car locked? Was the key in the ignition? Do you live in a neighborhood? I was visiting some friends in rural Pennsylvania a weekend ago, and they're like, we don't bother locking our car. We don't even lock our house. It's just a very low crime area. But, so were they doing the things that you should be doing? Did they have multi-factor authentication on some obscure thing out here? We know it's bad, but is it really bad? When you take the whole environment into perspective. We talked about it gets really complicated, and organizations sometimes just kind of get paralyzed, and that's when they say, "Just tell me what I need to buy and what color should the blinky light."
I'm on this kick where we talk about the supply chain, right? And relating it to
I don't think it's called a kick. I think it's called a career.
Is career? Yeah, that's where I work at Eclipsium, wearing the shirt tonight. But if you could know before you purchase something the level of trustworthiness you have in that device, and this relates back to cars. So we covered the Kia boys on multiple episodes, and I want to go into a whole bunch of details on that. But my whole thing with the supply chain is, before I buy something, I want to buy something that has a higher level of trustworthiness than the other things on my list, right? Like if I buy something, I want the highest level of trustworthiness because that is going to reduce ultimately my attack surface in the future and give me less problems to deal with. That's my take. So to relate that to cars, if I'm car shopping and I'm looking at vehicles and I'm looking at Kia vehicles, I want the resource that I'm going to say, hey, look, Kia vehicles between these model years, these models in these years, they don't come with an immobilizer, right? I want to know that. I want to factor that into my risk equation of the equipment that I'm buying so that I can make a smart choice and go, I mean, it's hard to threat model that particular scenario to like come to the conclusion of where we are today, where if you do have a Kia of that model from those model years, there's a high likelihood that it's going to be stolen. So much so that insurance companies are not even insuring some of these vehicles in certain areas, right? But like, I want that level of it's not so much assurance, right? I look at assurance as validating it once I own it. I look at how much can I trust this particular device or purchase versus something similar, right? And that's part of the product we built at Eclipsium that we released this week, and that's how I think of it in my brain. And I think of it like when we go buy other products, like I did the analysis on Android TV devices. Like I'd love to have a thing that people can go to be like, if you're going to buy an Android TV device, like you don't want one that already has malware on it. Like here's the analysis, here's the database, here's the consumer reports, here's the one you want. And it's not just about user experience, but like one criteria is security and integrity of that device, the supply chain security of that device.
My fear though is that if and when SBOMs, let's say, become mandatory, aren't they just going to be an appendix to the EULA?
I mean,
in as much as nobody's going to read it.
I hope that factors in into the purchasing decision, right? SBOM is a mechanism to be able to make those decisions and collect the data that is necessary to be able to make those decisions. Jeff, I don't think SBOM is I go to the SBOM and that tells me whether or not I want to buy the product or not, right?
Right. Like it's not the be all end all. It's going to be a rating.
Yeah, there's a rating that has to be derived from the SBOM and other factors as well. My coworker Scott Shefferman was going through some of those earlier today. He was like, there's who manufactured the product, where was the product manufactured, what track record does the vendor have that manufactured said product, and you could apply that to really any product that we acquire, whether it's a car or whether it's a router or whatever it is, right? All of those are factors. I, as the consumer or enterprise that's bringing this device in my environment, I don't want to have to create my own mechanism for rating all those factors. I want some help with that.
Well, you can lead a horse to water, right?
Yeah, we can hope that it factors into the... Josh, we're hitting on a point that I think you have some thoughts on.
So, I mean, you want to talk SBOMs, you want to talk factors and ratings. CISA just released some new information about VEX, the Vulnerability Exchange Program. The point is that SBOMs and similar, there are other things, but SBOMs are a pretty big thing right now with the executive order and all, are going to be used for ratings because you're going to get rated on how up to date, and how many vulnerabilities are inherently resident in your software.
And depending on the industry, how quickly you can remediate and how you can offer patches to your customer base. 524B for healthcare.
Go another level up, and how fast did you remediate? In other words, your SBOMs and VEX data show that you had problem X, vulnerability X, whatever in your software, and it took you 6 months to remediate, whereas the next vendor down the road took a month and a half to remediate a similar vulnerability. I'm going to go with them because they're faster at their shit.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly.
So you're going to get time-based. You're going to get time-based rating management and stars. 5-star manufacturer fixes stuff fast. All right, 2-star manufacturer takes months to put out patches and ignores me along the way. You're effectively building out an eBay-style rating system of sorts. Somebody's going to pull it together and do that in the near future.
And let's just hope it's better than Amazon ratings.
Related to the rating systems, CVSS 4.0.
I was thinking the same thing, Larry.
It's a great segue. Yeah. That was a great segue.
It was an awesome segue.
So I actually did it. I will apologize. I've slept a couple of times since then, but the day of the announcement that it was open for public comment, I actually did a webcast on CVSS 4.0 and the changes that were happening, and I think it's a good thing, arguably. Specifically around the new supplemental metric groups, specifically around the safety, the automation, the vulnerability response effort, and provider urgency. as well as some environmental type of evaluation, such as consumer assessed and provider assessed safety for focus on OT, ICS, medical, and so forth. So depending on the environment, it could receive some modifiers to that score. And if the vulnerabilities themselves lead themselves to be more easily exploited due to wormability or exploit or automation and that type of stuff, receives a higher score because of those as well.
So, quick question, because the link that Paul had was just sort of to like bullet points summary of the changes coming. I assume there's detail other places, but and I see, which is off to the side in the column. My question is version 4 in, I guess in theory this was true of version 3 too. They've got a calculator there. Is the calculator, what's the best way to ask this question? Is the calculator intended to be used by the consumer or Qualys Rapid7 Tenable?
Or the supplier of said software also sometimes calculates their own score, which differs from the NVD score.
Yes,
fair enough. But I guess to restate my question, is version 4 going to be more accessible to organizations to be able to come up with their own scoring system on severity of the vulnerability based on their own environments versus, I wish we could get over every organization I work with just takes the score that comes from whatever scan engine they use?
And I say yes to this, specifically around
my question, question is, does the scan engine produce its own CVSS score, or is it using the score that is coming from NVD? Because NVD is what's providing the score based on CVSS methodology.
And this is
on whether you're talking Tenable or not, right?
And this is perfect to Jeff's question, because like I would argue that those scan engines are going to use the one that comes from NVD, but that then now, so the answer to Jeff's question is yes. Who's it accessible to? Now, you as a consumer, as someone that is receiving these CVSS scores from the scan engine, can now enhance those CVSS scores, or maybe your scan engine even has the availability for you to plug in some default metrics to enhance those automatically for you, especially around the environmental, when we're talking ICS, OT, healthcare, automotive, and those types of things.
You can redefine the score in most vulnerability management platforms, but what Jeff, I think you're talking about is you plug it into a formula. So, like, you calculate your own formula.
Well, there's a calculator. It's right there on the left.
The calculator's always been there. Yeah, but even prior to version 4, it's not always been there, but it has been there for some time.
It's definitely been there since 3.
Yeah,
I don't know. Right,
for version 3, you can go plug stuff in and calculate your own score. That's different from accepting the score that comes from the vendor or your vulnerability management provider, or just, we used to call it recasting the risk, but I think it's really just reassigning a new score to it without plugging it into the calculator, all of which give you a different score, potentially.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I haven't brought up PCI yet, so now's a good time.
We should talk about PCI. I mean,
Well, in this context, PCI since version 2, which was published in 2010, allows companies, organizations to recast, to use the Tenable language, but come up with their own risk ranking based on their own circumstances, environment, architecture. Since 2010, you haven't had to take the score that comes from the vulnerability scan.
Right, but that's work. That's work, though. That's work.
It does take work, and it takes thinking, and it takes decision making, and it takes knowing what your environment is and knowing the architecture, which you're supposed to anyway.
Oh God, who wants to do that? I want to just take the NVD score and go, I'm going to patch everything over a 7.0. Done.
Right.
But if you're an ICSOT, could that CVSS, that 5 CVSS, be now a 9 based on those environmental factors?
It could be also.
But you got to do.
We're tailoring. Let's do RMF.
But you got to
do. Just do RMF.
You got to do the work to make that happen.
I want to go in a different direction and talk about monitoring these scores, because what I've observed for quite some time is that these scores change. That the factor in the score could be, is an exploit available? The answer today could be no. Next week,
well, it's only changing because one of these variables changed.
Correct. But you have to monitor that change. And I am very gravely concerned organizations' ability to monitor the changes in these scores and apply those. I think that, like, let's say you've recast, to use the tenable term, recast a risk of a particular vulnerability. How do you know? Like, what if the NVD score changed because someone actually did develop an exploit?
Okay.
Like, but what's the feedback loop for that? Because I've read research recently, like I think it was last week, I read research where they were like, look, we did a pen test in this software. It was in a medical environment, and it had a CVE number, and it had an NVD score, and it was lower because there was no exploit available. We looked at the vulnerability, and within a week, we came up with an exploit, and now we need to recalculate that and then re-disseminate that information to the organizations. But if you've calculated your own score, does it take into account the new, like, how does all that work? That's where I have grave concerns.
Here's how is designed to work in PCI, and again, since 2010, and I'll try to put it in the context of CVSS version 4. You're not allowed to, get a scan. Oh crap! Here's a finding. We got to do something with it. Oh, let's just recast it. Let's tweak it and drive it down somehow. You're not allowed to do that. So, the answer to your question is, as an organization, all the different variables that are outlined here, and some new, some existing, some have been tweaked. You need to have ahead of time your criteria based on your own environment of how you calculate these scores, what goes into the calculations of these scores. So you shouldn't be adjusting the finding based on a scan result, but you're absolutely able to adjust all the variables and criteria that go into the scoring system in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
and that eliminates I think what you're trying to define as. But you should
be limited.
Wild West.
You should be limited to which factors you can control, and whether or not.
I think you are.
Yeah, whether or not an exploit exists is not something that you can control. So therefore, that factor in the score, you shouldn't be able to control. You should be able to control your compensating controls, right? And then it should be factored together, because maybe your compensating controls remediate the exploit exists or not, or maybe it doesn't, right? Like, you don't know.
But my guess is that the calculator doesn't let you tweak every single one of these factors. That there's only certain ones that you can modify.
Well, Paul, Jeff, your point about doing it in advance makes sense. Anything that's a 7 or above has to be handled in this amount of time, or with this level. The CISO has to sign off on it, or whatever. Anything that is a threat to our crown jewel data has to be handled in this form of fashion. Has to go through change management, whatever. But once the actual system happens, once you go, okay, we've got a new vulnerability, run it through the process and see what we're going to do about it. Okay, it's listed as a 6, but because we're in critical infrastructure, it moves up to an 8, whatever it is, and it attacks crown jewel data.
That's not what I'm saying exactly there. I'm saying that your criteria, especially using this calculator, or something similar with the CVSS version 4 or version 3, you're tweaking the variables that determine the score, not you're changing the impact or what you have to do with whatever the score is. Well, I'll make sure.
Well, okay,
but
so I'm expanding it. I apologize. You're correct. I was extending it. You can have, but there's got to be a process. Here is how we score things based on whatever characteristics we see when we start the process, and based on the score, here's what we do about them based on the score and the components of the score. But yeah, we're talking the same thing.
So I would recommend to anybody that's out there doing this, and I have companies that actually kind of do this right. They don't change the overall, critical, high, medium, low in terms of the 1 to 10 scale, but which I think is fair. I think it's good to normalize on that. But what you have the opportunity to do is change the calculation, change the variables, and change the weight, I guess, of some of these variables.
Correct.
I guess you're not changing the algorithm, whatever the formula is, but you're changing the values that are assigned based on some pre-established criteria.
Like you're weighting the variables according to your company's peculiarities and idiosyncrasies.
But these are very subjective, as we've seen recently.
Absolutely,
they can be.
But okay, let's take the curl example where it gets assigned a CVE number, it gets a score from NVD, and it's supercritical 9.8. But the folks that make the software are like, yes, it's an integer overflow, sure, but it's not exploitable. But NVD goes, well, since it's an integer overflow, you're right, and it's already been patched. Almost that's beside the point. But just rating the score, barring any patch, integer overflow is subjective. NVD is saying since it's an integer overflow, therefore it carries this weight. The people closer to the software are like, integer overflow in this context isn't really that exploitable. So therefore it's a 4 or a 3. It could have that drastic of an impact.
That's an interesting question of how do you see the Swiss cheese? Gulf Sponsor taught me this a long friggin' time ago. Vulnerabilities are Swiss cheese. You can have a vulnerability, but unless the holes in the Swiss cheese line up to get from one side to the other, you're not getting through. You're not exploiting the thing all the way.
Correct.
So what they're saying, what the people that built that software are saying is, sorry, it doesn't go all the way through. It's not that exploitable. What NVD was saying was because it is this class of vulnerability, integer overflow, it is automatically exploitable. And that's just not cool. I don't agree with that.
Right. And there's also the case in a supply chain that used to drive me nuts as a developer is tools would say, you included this library, and it has a 9.8, CVSS score in that particular library, and I'm like, yeah, that's great, but my code never calls the vulnerable function.
Right.
And that's not that's a compensation. That's an exploitability factor compensation.
In my environment, not your environment. Josh's environment, you may call that function.
No. Right? We're on the same page.
Yeah.
You're saying this is a 9.8 coming into my environment, but because the peculiarities or the differences in my environment, in my world where I use that library, it is not a 9.8, it is a 2.5 or whatever I'm making this crap up.
But now I should fix it because I have to be confident in a couple of things. One, that none of my code actually calls that vulnerable function and code gets complex, right? Or I also have to bank on the fact that the next release of my code is not going to call this function. I don't think that absolves you from fixing it or tailoring your response to that, based on your compensating control. I still think you need to fix it and maybe carry a higher weight that, if we did call this code, we would be introducing a really critical, easily exploitable vulnerability into our software, right? So none of this is, I guess my point in this whole conversation is none of this is as absolute as a score, right? That it's all intricacies and various factors.
But even a score isn't absolute. I mean, we've just spent the last how many minutes talking about how the score itself
can change.
Can be very subjective,
right?
And it can change. So I reject your last statement.
And insert my own.
And substitute my own. Thank you.
It's absolute in that moment in time. How about that?
It's an interesting point that we're talking about customizing and tailoring scores that should be cut and dried. It should be no big deal to score something right off the bat because it does this, it's this way, it's this exploitable. But instead, we're talking about, how do we score things? The fact that the discussion of scoring is so relevant, so dependent, I should say, on very specific factors that are specific to a specific environment.
But I love this, Josh. We should just have two.
Right.
We should just have two different things. No big deal.
Well, Paul,
and we're going to patch it. Right? It's a 0, it's a 1. No big deal, or we're going to patch it.
Well,
that's Paul's CVSS scoring.
I think I'm going to a similar place where you are, Paul, in that, going back to what we were talking earlier about with the risk equation, all of these factors and things that could change are really some application of the countermeasure. If you think back to, whereas maybe we're overthinking this. Maybe a vulnerability should have a score that's relatively static, based on some relatively static criteria, and then a secondary aspect is to take into account the countermeasures, because that's really what's been, in theory, being done anyway.
I agree.
Is this an internet remote vulnerability, but the system in question is 17 layers deep in your environment, and nobody on the internet is going to get there? Whatever you want to say, how many hops away? What? And I'm intrigued to learn what the meanings are of all these new criteria that they brought out there. But what are the conditions that have to be in place? I remember arguing it with Renault back when I was at Tenable, when SSL was deprecated in early TLS. That was a big deal for PCI, and Renault and I would argue about, NIST says it's bad, so we should score it bad. And Renault was like, yeah, but, and I'm paraphrasing, and I'm not going to attempt a French accent, but there's so many conditions that have to be right, and there's so much data that has to be collected in order to begin to be able to exploit the deprecated algorithm. And then what do you get at the end of the day? You get, one credit card.
You should have done that in a French accent. It would have been better.
It would have been way better.
It would, but every one of my accents sounds like an Indian accent, so I just don't bother. I can't do accents. I'm sorry.
All right, even my pirate accent turns into a drunk Irishman at some point, but...
I want to talk about
French accent is easy. You just look at the screen, tilt your head, and go.
Have you guys watched NCIS?
Yes.
Right.
I feel like this is a loaded question.
It is a loaded question.
Yes. Which NCIS?
There's a lot of NCIS. I'm talking about
There's a new one.
Is that the original? Was it the original one with Gibbs? Gibbs.
Yep.
And
Gibbs. Yep.
That's the one I watched. Actually, I thought that was a pretty decent
But there's
show.
a new one I just saw an ad for that's like NCIS Paris or something like that. It's like somewhere like not in the U.S.
They really banked on that brand and created a lot of offshoots.
Yeah.
I mean,
yep.
Look, Law and Order did not do a bad thing, okay?
Like Star Wars fashion, like they really banked on the original brand and created a lot of offshoots. Like, oh, you were an extra in the original movie, so we're going to create a whole series about you. Great. And that's an exaggeration. But where I'm getting to is...
Not by much.
The reason I'm talking about this is my story. I thought this was just hilarious, and I want to talk about it. So we're going to have some fun now.
All right, let's have fun.
My story number 7 is only one hacker at the keyboard, amateurs. And I remember this scene. Is it Gabby? Gabby is like the hacker person on the show that runs the lab kind of thing. Abby. Thank you.
Abby Shuto.
Yeah. And in this scene, they're getting hacked. And like while they're getting hacked, they're talking about how to mitigate the hack. And Abby's at the keyboard. And then the other character, I forget his name. McGee is like, oh, I can help. And McGee and Abby are typing on the same keyboard at the same time to mitigate the hack. And I'm like, the Hackaday article kind of talks about they link to some possibilities where this might be possible, which I think is friggin' awesome, right? Because this is where our brains would go. Like, is this is Johnny Long's Hacking Hollywood, like debunking like what has been put out there. And my favorite part about the scene is Gibbs, is that his name in the show? Gibbs, plural, right?
Yep.
Goes in and just unplugs the computer. It's like, I stopped the attack. And so like this whole article is about the possibility of people hacking on the same keyboard, the ridiculousness that surrounds this entire scene of two people performing incident response and countermeasures on the same keyboard, which is just hilarious. You got to watch the YouTube clip because it will. Well,
and in the comments,
it's refreshing. It's refreshing.
Gibbs didn't unplug the computer. He unplugged the monitor.
Oh yes, it totally looks that way in the scene. Now that you say that, Jeff.
So I will tell you that I am significantly embarrassed by my reaction when I watched that scene originally of when it was playing first time. I went, the keyboard buffer can't handle all those keystrokes. Oh wait.
So I'm like, and if we're on the subject of CSI, what they had the CSI Cyber one, that like so many people in our industry were like, that is a whole load of crap.
A lot of the technology in the entire NCIS universe, if you will, if there is such a thing, is really kind of ridiculous. I think all around. I think all around, like forensics, the whole thing is. I think you even commented on this in years past. Like, I'm going to take the sample and like run it through a mass spectrometer, and 5 minutes later,
not even 5 minutes.
Yeah,
like
instantly, mass spectrometers just give me the answer, right?
But so. That was my wife's beef with like CSI Las Vegas. It was always like, oh, we're gonna throw this thing in mass spec, and 10 seconds later we have a result. Right. I'm like, that shit could take hours, but that doesn't make for good TV.
There was a great case too, not a great case, but a case where they were trying to get, I don't know, it was DNA sampling or something like that, and they're like, oh, we'll have more information in like 5 to 6 months.
Yeah,
and in these kind of shows, that information, whether it's computers, whether it's forensics or whatever, is for the plot instantaneous. And like, that's not how law enforcement or forensics works in real life. It's certainly not how computers work in real life.
I have to tell you a story really quickly.
And then I've got one real quick too.
Okay, so B-Sides Delaware, I don't know, 2006, 2007, we had the conference, and it happened, a Bond movie was coming out that night, like premiering. So we asked, does anybody want to go to the Bond movie? Like, yeah. So we bought like 35 tickets. We went to the theater. It was not a big theater. It was one of the neighborhood theaters, whatever. So we had half the theater, okay? And the other half of the theater was normal people, muggles.
Non-hackers, mostly.
Yeah.
Non-hackers. So I think it was Skyfall, I think. And so the movie goes on, and every time there's a tech scene, there's just giggling coming from our side of the theater, and the other half of the theater is going, "What are you doing? This is awesome." We're like, "You don't get it. Never mind."
No, it's not. It's not reality. It's bad.
So my story. We were at Disney last week, and I had a little bit of a shock. There's a ride at Animal Kingdom that they're allegedly going to shut down. We had never been on as a family, and that's Dinosaur at Animal Kingdom. And it's not a good ride. It's supposed to be one of those amazing thrill rides. It's not good. It's uncomfortable. But you walk in, and the pre-show is talking about how you're going to go back in time, and I don't want to give the whole ride away. You're going to go back in time, and you're going to get a dinosaur and so forth. But the director, the person that plays the director of the Dinosaur Research Institute or whatever is Felicia Rashad.
Oh, I've been on this ride before.
So Mrs. Cosby.
Yes. I've been in this ride
and
before.
Then the scientist that is going off book and booking this journey for you to go back to the dinosaurs and so forth is Wallace Langham, who played David Hodges on CSI Las Vegas.
Okay.
Oh, God.
Yeah. I was like, oh, should I know? Oh,
is this one of the rides where the T-Rex scares you at the end? Kind of. Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yep.
Definitely been on that ride.
We were not fans of that ride. We had never been on it, and the two kids and I went on it, and it was no. We went on it once, and we can say that we've been on it, and now it can go away.
So I have one more comment about this article. One hacker at the keyboard, amateurs. I've always been kind of stymied by, even when it was just one person at the keyboard and they're typing away, blocking an active attack, or they're attacking. What the heck are they actually typing?
Oh, if you look at the computer monitors during this scene, Jeff, I mean, it's
like
worse than almost worse than hackers. What's on the screen? Yeah. It's bad.
So, you want to know what they're typing? Go to hackertyper.net.
I knew it.
I am mildly curious because I'm like, if they're writing command lines and they're doing it on the fly, super. Nobody does that without making.
It's because what we really do would be it would be really boring. It would be like just looking over our shoulder. And we're Google searching for something, right? And then, like reading the article, and then like, oh, that's the command I need to run. Like copy, paste, right? That would be really boring.
Finding the man page.
Yeah. Then doing some more reading, and then like copying the command and going, crap, that doesn't work on my version of Windows. I gotta go read some more.
Yeah, and of course, again, I'm dating myself, and it made a difference whether you were in a Bourne shell or a Corn shell. What was the backspace and what was the delete character?
Yeah, right.
And sometimes,
So, I was on a pen test relatively early on in my career at Guardians. Not in my career, in Guardians with Mr. Tom Liston.
Yeah.
And it was awesome because it was Tom Liston. They were a great customer, and one of the folks that listened to the show worked there at the time. This one of our contacts comes in. Tom had just reported to him that we got access to something that we shouldn't have, and he comes into the office where we're hanging out working on stuff, and he's like, "How the heck do you guys do this?" And Tom's coming to and why can't our guys get this stuff figured out when they're doing stuff internally? And Tom's comment was, "I can just Google better than they can."
It's such a Tom Liston, and
he's not wrong. So, yeah.
Now we can just chat GPT better than other people.
I can engineer my chat GPT prompts better than your guys can.
Right.
Do you know what a prompt engineer makes these days?
Yes.
There are jobs for AI prompt engineer. They make $200K. Easy.
Yeah. Like that's starting. That's base. If you're good at it.
That's like, what's your job description? I know how to talk to computers. Basically, that's what that is.
What's your job description? I got ChatGPT to write this for me.
Right.
Anyway. I use ChatGPT to hack in and change the HR to job description.
Yeah. Where do we go from here?
Oh God!
I don't know if there's anything to top that. I'm sorry.
Your story, Paul's story number 5. Something fun.
Getting rickrolled. Was this the Ghidra?
The Ghidra rickroll.
Yeah. Oh, so Ghidra will automatically detect and render images. And I mean, this is, talk about the serious part of this first, right? When we use tools as security researchers, oftentimes those tools are basically like shortcuts, right? And this ties into another story that I have with some firmware analysis framework that I use called EMBA, which I'm super impressed with, right? But even all the predecessors to that, and many of the tools that we have, I think we're presented with, at the end of the day, large amounts of data that we have to sift through to find some kind of issue, or at least identify areas that we should look at more closely, right? Because we may have gigabytes, hundreds of megabytes of code, binaries, whatever, to analyze. Where do you start in that? Like you're doing it all without the help of some kind of tool is not feasible. Yes, you can do it. It's going to take a lot of time. And I think many of us rely on tools to go, here's the area where you should start looking at, right? Here are some things you should start looking at. With these tools, automated tools, right, automatically detect and render things like images, so you can embed an image in there and it will render the Rickroll as an example, which I think is great.
But now, and this becomes, as you were saying this, Paul, it becomes kind of fascinating of what happens if the rendering engine that is used to either play the audio or to display the image has a vulnerability that can be triggered by malformed data.
I know where you're going on this, right? In one of the areas that, especially folks like you and I that do a lot of firmware analysis, you get that firmware and you run it through the automated tool, and it doesn't quite fully understand what that firmware is, and just interprets everything as something, and it can just spin and spin and spin. And then like 48 hours later, you're like, oh, that's not going so well. Right? So it can almost work to your detriment.
Right.
In that regard.
Or like, oh, you got this thing, and like, oh, it found this data struct, and it's an image, and now we'll display that image for you. But that display of that image calls some image magic library, and that image magic library has a vulnerability that's triggered by malformed data. And now you're screwed. You're screwed, right? Like this is the Wireshark plugins problem, or the Wireshark protocol decoder problems. You capture packet capture, and you capture malformed packets, and there's a vulnerability in one of the decoders, so you view this packet, and now there's a decoder that doesn't examine this packet where there's a buffer overflow and remote code execution happens. Fuck. Right?
Clever.
Yeah.
I was thinking, why would you watch an hourglass spin for 48 hours, Paul? But then I thought, oh yeah, you remember the early days of the internet when it would take that long for websites to load.
Yep,
this is true.
I can remember downloading CGA-based images.
And you do that because you're working on other things while that's crunching away, and you hope that it's doing something useful until you find out that it's not, really, and you're like, back to the drawing board, and then you make some adjustments and you start again, right?
But PSA, most default timeouts are like, 90 seconds, maybe 3 minutes tops. So,
or it
next
uses,
time you come back to it, if it's still spinning.
It uses an exorbitant amount of disk space. I mean, that happens too. All of this, Emba will so what is my story number, Emba? I sent this to you, Larry.
Yes.
There's been a lot. 11. So there's been a lot of frameworks and tools that can automatically like pick apart firmware. And again, it's a shortcut for us, right? Like it's not. I don't think that at least in my experience and with my coworkers, we're not looking at, hey, I'm going to take this firmware, I'm going to run it through this tool, and it's going to do my job for me, right? It's going to find the vulnerabilities. It's going to report them to the vendor. Like I'm not automating my job as a security researcher. That is not our expectation. Our expectation is, even if I got a 20 meg firmware file, tell me where to look, or extract the important pieces. Tell me what those are so that I can go look at those pieces. Tell me what they are. Tell me what that password hash is. Tell me what that file system is. Mount that file system. And we're looking for that level of automation. Emba is like one of the newer frameworks that do this, I think, really well. I've run a few different firmware files through it, and it's a great project that is really helping automate a lot of that from initial firmware analysis, Larry. Right? Like that's just the beginning. Like, oh, I extracted the entire web interface for you.
Great.
I didn't find any vulnerabilities in it. Maybe I ran SemGrep against it, but those results are kind of wonky. Now it's up to you, right? But like, I didn't have to do the work of going, which file system partition is it?
So like this is back to like pen testing and automation.
Yeah.
You go do pen testing, use automation, and then the magic comes from the manual interpretation of those results and whether you can make things work. And if there's something that with a small tweak could actually work and or couldn't.
Right. Like in my example, I ran some firmware through Emba, and it didn't automatically crack the password hash that it had found. So it extracted a file system. It looked through all the files. It was like, hey, you've got an Etsy shadow. It has a password hash. Let me try and crack that for you. Nope. And it failed. And I was like, really? I'm like, all right, let me take a stab at it. I'm like, ChatGPT, which password hash type is this? And ChatGPT was like, it's this. I'm like, cool. I'm like, hey, Hashcat, take this password database, run it through this hash. And like a couple of minutes later, it was like, I cracked the password for you. I'm like, sweet. And actually,
and again, admittedly, back to some of Jeff's comments about timeouts, you went to Hashcat and you went to GPU,
right?
And Emba is probably not doing those types of things.
Yeah, because I was running Emma in a VM. Right. I did, to your point, Larry. I mean, I don't have a great password cracking rig. Like, I just use my 1080 Ti, which in today's day and age is actually kind of slow in terms of GPU cracking.
It's better than what I got.
I'm like, sure, use my 1080 Ti, download the Linux drivers, blah blah blah, the CUDA packages in Linux. I'm like, go do that, and I was like, oh, cool, I cracked it. Nice, sweet. And then we actually submitted a report back to Emba to say this was our experience, and so nice. they could make it better. So the team is really great. My coworkers are working with some of the internal team to help make this better. In terms of open source firmware analysis tools, Larry, this one's like high up on my list. Like it's really good. Yeah. Totally. So if you're doing that kind of work, make sure you take a look at Emba.
Yep.
Can I ask a real quick stupid question, Paul?
Yeah.
When did you start getting news stories from GitHub?
So I follow a while ago, Jeff, to answer your question specifically, but I follow some Reddit groups that highlight cybersecurity hacking related projects, and it's often linked back to GitHub.
Yep.
I also have many other kind of searches in my feeds that look for certain keywords. And
it just seems like every story you've picked tonight has been a GitHub page, and I'm like, what? And I don't remember that before.
Yeah, so, GitHub is a great for this show. Great way to find like new security research and tools that are happening. And I like to link back to your point, Jeff, to the GitHub repository for it, because that's the ultimate source of truth, right? You can have an article that wrote about, hey, this new project came about, but I'm like, GitHub is the source.
Same, and like some of those sources, I'll argue GitHub, all sorts of other unusual places. Like, I think some of my better stories have not even come out of some of my feeds lately. It's been like things that other folks that have brought up, and brought up in a more general context, like, like somebody at work found the bypassing, the QNAP worms of critical and command injection stuff. And I'm like, oh, cool.
Larry, is the flash chip reader you have a CH341A? Or is that a different chipset?
Is that your...
Flash programmer shows some nifty tricks.
Your number 3.
Yeah, so this person took a CH341A USB bus converter chip and created a program that expands its capabilities. Turns out it can talk I2C, which is like it's like UART, but not UART. I2C.
Yep.
It's like it's not UART, but it is. It's a serial protocol.
Yep. It's a serial protocol bus,
right.
Effectively. Yep.
You got it talking to some smart batteries, some GPIOs, environmental sensors, and even an FM radio module. So he's able to like use this chipset to talk to other components and other things on different protocols.
So you say, hey Larry, the one you have, does it have this chipset? I will fully admit I probably have about a dozen different ones.
Of these, right?
And I say this because I was doing a little clean out of my office Monday as we came back to move some stuff around because now new shit showed up in my office and I need to make room for it. And I have all those, as you may have seen, I have all these little wooden drawers behind my chair.
Yeah.
And there's even more of them on the other side of the room. And I had to go through a bunch of stuff and like take stuff out of these boxes that were like project shit in it, that the project is over, and I just need to sort it back into its constituent type of like stuff for reading JTAG. Like I think I dropped like 4 different platforms of stuff that I'd used into that drawer, and like chip read. I think I dropped half a dozen of things between like testing for stuff for day job and or things to use for Sec 556 for IoT hacking, and
So what you're saying is you probably have a CH34 341A
probably
somewhere.
probably.
When you get some time and you find it, you want to refer back to this article, Larry, because the guy released some open source software on Windows that enabled this chipset to read different things.
That's awesome,
including battery firmware, which is like the bane of my existence.
And I know why you're looking at that. Oh, and that reminds me, I actually saw it recently too, that someone released an open source controller for e-bikes.
Oh, interesting.
Based on like an ESP32 or something of the like.
Nice.
Yep.
I've seen some of the e-bike stuff. My challenge is with a certain manufacturer of scooter or hoverboard things.
Yep.
And as far as I can tell, I did get a new battery for one of mine. And I think the board purposely bricked the firmware because I ordered the battery from China, and the battery management system wasn't compatible.
Oh.
And stupidly, I updated firmware, and part of that firmware update from the main manufacturer was to update the firmware on the battery, and they weren't compatible. And so now I've got a new battery that conceivably does work, but is also a brick because I think it bricked the firmware on it. And that's why I was looking at this project, because I'm like, can I reprogram the firmware on the new battery? And what would I do that with? I'd need the original firmware for it, which they don't make available. Battery stuff is weird.
Yeah. Speaking of original firmware, maybe one last story.
Yeah.
Because
we got
to leave time for automation. I saw some stuff that proof of concept exploit for WiseCam version 3 devices.
Yeah,
this was one of your
Don't
stories.
tell me this.
Yep.
Why do you run WiseCam?
I have WiseCam at I have WiseCam at our old house.
Yep. I also have WiseCams. None of them 3s, but
I have 1s, 2s, and 3s because I was curious at the difference in quality of picture as well as the difference in features. Plus, I'm too lazy to pull out the old ones.
Yep. I mean, if they work, they give you cameras. They do.
There's a authentication bypass in the camera daemon, allowing attackers to use arbitrary pre-shared keys during the TLS handshake to bypass security measures.
Look, Wisecams are Chinese cameras that Amazon likes. They're cheap. They're great because they're dirt cheap. They automatically go to the cloud. It's silly easy to set up. It's wonderful.
Yep. They do support, and they do support open source and the hacking community, and they allow folks to develop third-party firmware for their devices as well.
Yeah, no, they're lovely, but they're Chinese. So don't use them to film your sex tape, okay? Or it'll get viewed by a wider audience than you really want it.
It would be in my category of when you buy it, it might be pre-owned. Like the firmware might have backdoors in it when you order it, much like your Android.
Dude, it's a Chinese camera that automatically sends video to the cloud. They don't even need to backdoor it. They just need to already on the server the video goes to.
I think I meant additional backdoors is what I meant.
Oh, additional backdoors because your sex tape needs additional backdoors.
You should run that firmware through Emba and see what you can find and let me know how you make out there. There are so many devices and so little time to analyze the firmware on.
Yep. So the one thing that really hit home about this particular article is that there was something going on with Pwn to Own, and that there was a patch right before Pwn to Own, and everybody was butthurt about it. And that Wise told the researcher that had this particular exploit for Wise that was allegedly on the table was that they were merely trying to safeguard their customers against a threat that they had learned about a few days before. And they said, I want to clarify a few things. We didn't know about the issue for years. This is an issue in third-party library we use and got a report about it just a few days before Pwn to Own. So it wasn't software that they developed. So this is a classic problem from IoT, is that you go and develop a bunch. You go develop your first-party stuff for your IoT device, specifically for its function, but you rely on libraries from a third party.
Because you're getting hardware from a third party,
right?
And to enable that hardware, because hardware without any kind of firmware or software is just a friggin' paperweight.
Yep.
And so you rely on that firmware to enable that hardware. And if that particular component within your device has a supply chain issue,
yep,
you inherit that.
Right. And like that third party could not only be from the hardware manufacturer for, say, a driver, that third party component, it could be also something that you're using to process the data that you get from that driver. Right. Like, oh, it's rendering an RTSP stream, so great, you're going to pipe that to an RTSP server, which is something that's open source, which is also now third-party stuff.
Right. It's like, I want to make a device, but I want to write as little code as possible to produce my device. I want to source all the hardware and software from other people that are making it.
Yep.
Inside your laptop, what I learned today from data we gathered for Eclipsium, your average OEM, and I'll name it. I mean, your average OEM that you would buy a PC or desktop from.
Yep.
You're talking in the enterprise, Dell, Lenovo, or HP. I'm not picking on any single one of them, right?
It's math.
It's math. But let's look at the supply chain that comes with those. You're looking at 60 different suppliers and 200 different sub-suppliers of that software, and likely 1,000 different components of hardware.
There's no way you're checking everything.
No,
not a single damn chance. There's going to be so many holes in that software.
Right. Think about the scale of that. Right. The scale of that is off the charts.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Anyway. With that
is all the time we have for this evening. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching this edition of Paul's Security Weekly. Larry, take us out.
Over and out.